Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here with another Friday Reads. I am reading, or have read this week, some great books. Middle grade nonfiction, a novel, and a fabulous memoir on audio. So I'm going to tell you all about those. It's been kind of a crazy morning here. We woke up to ice on the trees, and around 11 o'clock, I said to my husband, "Did you turn the thermostat up this morning? Because it feels pretty cold in here." And sure enough, it was working during the night, but at some point this morning, our heat stopped running. And yeah, ice on the trees means it's pretty cold out, so we had to have a repairman out. Anyway, I'm recording a little late today, but I wanted to squeeze this in. First up, I had a little time to kill before my buddy reads started, so I squeezed in one of the history comics, which I love, Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin, Civil Rights Heroes, by Tracy Baptiste and Shauna J. Grant. So this is a middle grade graphic nonfiction book. I love the history comics. It is a wonderful series. I've read the one about the Chicago fire. There was another one I read that same year that I'm not thinking of right now. I'll put the name up here. And last year, I think, the national parks, preserving America's wild places. This was fabulous. Every kid in America should read this. So the history comics do a great job of teaching kids about history and getting into some details that they're probably not learning in school, because I didn't learn this in school. And I found this was particularly the case. With this book. Rosa Parks, we all know her story, right? She refused to give up her seat on a bus, triggered the Montgomery bus boycott. So we know that story, right? Wrong. I was shocked to learn while reading this book that Rosa Parks had actually been an ardent supporter of civil rights and a leader in their local civil rights community for years before that day when she refused to give up her seat on the bus. Months before Rosa Parks did that, another woman, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin, refused to give up her seat on the bus and was arrested and treated horribly by the police. Claudette was really the one who sparked what came afterwards, although a whole group of people had been working toward these goals for a long time. And that is really the focus of this book. It tells Claudette's story and it tells Rosa Parks' story, but it also is strongly making the point, because we don't learn about Claudette in our history classes, do we? It's making the point that any kind of real change in society comes from a lot of people acting, not just the one or two leaders we hear about. So this book was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much, not just about the civil rights story that we know, but about the people behind it. A lot of them women who we've never heard of before. It's a fascinating story. It's beautifully told. It's the beginning of Claudette's story as a child before they moved to the city, riding the bus, which she did every day to get to school. It was just a wonderful book, so well done, absolutely fascinating. I mean, so many times while reading this, I just said to myself, I never knew that. It just can't recommend it enough. For middle graders, but for adults too. I learned so much. So that's Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin, Civil Rights Heroes, one of the history comics. This one is by Tracy Baptiste and Shauna J. Grant. Don't miss this, or any of this series. And now I am enjoying Deacon King Kong by James McBride. the buddy read that I've been waiting for. I'm buddy reading this with Nikki, who had the channel Red Dot Reads. She is not keeping the channel up anymore. But we've stayed in touch. I love buddy reading with her. She and I have become good friends through our buddy reads, and this book is one that both of us have been wanting to read a while. It was on my shelf, so I'm thrilled to finally get to it. This is the first James McBride novel I've ever read, and I've been hearing so much about him for years, so I'm glad I finally got to it. I'm not too far in yet, just a few chapters, but the main character, the title character, is a man affectionately known as Sportcoat. He's actually been known by that nickname since childhood, but he is a deacon in his church. The setting for this novel is a huge part of the story, I can tell already, and that is a housing project in Brooklyn in 1969. I can already see why McBride is such an acclaimed author. He's created such vivid characters here, and it is a wildly diverse cast of characters. I wanted to read it this month for Black History Month, but it's all kinds of history because the housing project has a very diverse group of people living there. And it's an enormous project surrounding a courtyard. And so the novel centers around something that happens in the courtyard. Actually, it's not a spoiler. It's in the very first pages, maybe on page 1. Sportcoat, who's a deacon in his church, one day takes out a gun and shoots the young man who's been selling drugs in their courtyard. Just walks up to him. He's in a crowd of drug buyers and buddies and shoots him. So that's kind of the trigger that sets off this story. I have no idea what's going to happen next, but I am loving the writing style and the characters. It's very funny. The characters all have funny names and nicknames, as well as just vivid personalities. So really enjoying Deacon King Kong with James McBride so far, and I can't wait to discuss it with Nikki. On audio, I've been listening to Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jawad. I've been meaning to read this book for ages, and I'm so glad I'm listening to it on audio. She narrates it herself. I had first heard of her and her story, which is about living with cancer and undergoing cancer treatment as a very young woman. I first heard about it because we're big fans of Jon Batiste, the musician. We knew he had taken a break from his career to support his wife and be there for her during her cancer treatment. What I didn't know was that her cancer journey had started years earlier when she was only 22 years old. And in fact, she probably had cancer 5 years before that because she had weird symptoms from the age of 18. Took that long to get diagnosed, and by then, of course, was quite advanced. She had a form of leukemia, so it goes through her experiences as this very young woman just out of college with this horrible diagnosis who has to go through these horrific treatments with very strong chemotherapy, with bone marrow transplant, years of painful, difficult treatments. And during that time, she ended up writing a column for the New York Times. I was laughing about this with my husband because there's so much here that I can relate to as someone who lives with chronic illness, who writes about it, who has met a lot of people because of my writing. She talks a lot about that. But I was laughing because I started a blog and was thrilled when I got a comment from one person. And, still 18 years later, my blog's not like well known or anything. She had a very different experience. Her first blog post, someone at the New York Times read it and called her and asked if she'd do a regular column. So her writing story is very different from mine. But there is so much I can relate to in terms of chronic illness. I've never done this with an audiobook before. I've always thought this was the downside of audio. You can't really tab interesting quotes or things that you relate to. I'm a big lover of tabbing quotes in books. But I'm listening to this on Libby, and I saw they had a bookmark feature, and I've been using it a lot because there's so much I relate to here. But I think in many ways, hers is a universal story because we all know someone who's been through cancer or other types of chronic illness. I'm in the part of the memoir now. Later on in the story, she's in remission. She is headed out on a road trip for 100 days, touring the country, meeting up with people that she only knows from either online interactions or because they wrote her letters after reading her New York Times column. And I can relate to this so much. When we travel, we meet up with the people that we know from our online support groups and that I've interacted with online. I understand how deep and meaningful these virtual relationships can become. So I am loving the memoir. It is excellent. Very well written. I have to admit, she deserved a New York Times column. She's a very good writer. I love that she's narrating it herself. Definitely recommend Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jawad. So that's what I'm reading this week. I would love to hear what you're reading. Please let me know in the comments down below.